This episode of Sleepy is proudly sponsored by Shopify. When I first started this show and started podcasting in general, I learned a lot of stuff the hard way. Writing, editing, recording, producing, marketing, social media. It was a lot to start doing this, and while I love knowing how to do all those things now, I definitely would have loved to know about tools that would have made my life simpler, like I do today. Tools that make my business and my life just run smoother. Well, Shopify is definitely one of those tools. It is the business behind the business. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world, from household names like Mattel to businesses just getting started. There's hundreds of ready-to-use templates to build a beautiful online store that matches your brand. Shopify has tons of helpful AI tools to help you build out and fill your site in no time. It's also really easy to get the word out with easily made email and social media campaigns. And best yet, Shopify is your commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. So if you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. Turn your big business idea into reality with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/Otis. Go to shopify.com/OTIS. Shopify.com/Otis. I'll put a link for this in the show notes. Thanks.
Time. It's always vanishing. The commute, the errands, the work functions, the meetings, selling your car. Unless you sell your car with Carvana. Get a real offer in minutes. Get it picked up from your door. Get paid on the spot. So fast, you'll wonder what the catch is. There isn't one. We just respect you and your time. Oh, you're still here? Move along now. Enjoy your day. Sell your car today.
Carvana.
Pickup fees may apply.
Hey, my name's Otis Gray, and you're listening to Sleepy. A podcast where I read old books to help you get to sleep. And this is another spooky October story for you. Tonight's story is from an author that we never read on the show before. And as far as spooky October stories go, this one is objectively less spooky and creepy and more just ethereal and a really fantastic story. So I think you're really going to like it. Really, really easy to doze off to. And before we get to the bedtime reading, I just want to profoundly thank all of our brand new patrons on patreon.com, which is a website you can go to and pledge a couple bucks for an ad-free version of the show. So, this week's wonderful new patrons: Pamela McIntosh, Diane Yee, Mrs. R, Leonora Stevens, Kelly Parker, Maud Bigelow, and Nathan Jones. Thank you all so much for being a part of making this show. It really, really means a lot to me. So thank you. And if you don't know, all the names that I just read are brand new supporters of Sleepy on Patreon, which just allows you to directly support the people who make the stuff that you like. It's really easy to do, and it really means a lot to me. So if you like Sleepy and maybe it's helped you get a better night's rest, then consider going to patreon.com/sleepyradio and donating even $1. At $2, like I said, you get an ad-free version of the show. $5, you get access to our poetry feed, all kinds of episodes you've never heard before. But even $1 goes such a long way for me, and I really appreciate it. And even $1, I'll read your name in the opening credits of our next Sunday show after you do. So again, if you would like to be a part of making this show, you can go to patreon.com/sleepyradio. Thanks. And as always, the music you're hearing is by my good friend James Lepkowski and the cover-up for Sleepy is by Gracie Kanan. We're halfway through this lovely, spooky October, and tonight is a story about it's about a young man who finds an old violin, and essentially finding this violin introduces some strange events into his life, some paranormal activity. But this one really isn't very creepy or spooky at all. It's just kind of ethereal, and it is a absolutely gorgeous read. Really fantastic. It's by an author named James Falkner, no relation to the Falkner you probably know. And I really hope that it helps you doze off into a deep slumber tonight. So, without further ado, The Lost Stradivarius by James Meade Falkner. And now is the time for you to fluff up your pillow just how you like it. Feel yourself melt into your bed. Get real comfortable. Close your eyes. And let me read to you. The Lost Stradivarius, Chapter 1. Your father, John Maltravers, was born in 1820 at Worth and succeeded his father and mine, who died when we were still young children. John was sent to Eton in due course, and in 1839, when he was 19 years of age, it was determined that he should go to Oxford. It was intended at first to enter him at Christ Church, but Dr. Sarsdell, who visited us in Worth in the summer of 1839, persuaded Mr. Thoresby, our guardian, to send him instead to Magdalen Hall. Dr. Sarsdell was himself principal of that institution and represented that John, who then exhibited some symptoms of delicacy, would meet with more personal attention under his care than he could hope to do in so large a college as Christ Church. Mr. Thoresby, ever solicitous for his ward's welfare, readily waived other considerations in favor of an arrangement which he considered conducive to John's health, and he was accordingly matriculated at Magdalen Hall in the autumn of 1839. Dr. Sarsdell had not been mindful of his promise to look after my brother, and had secured him an excellent first-floor sitting room, with a bedroom adjoining, having an aspect towards New College Lane. I shall pass over the first 2 years of my brother's residence at Oxford, because they have nothing to do with the present story. They were spent, no doubt, in the ordinary routine of work and recreation common in Oxford at that period. From his earliest boyhood, he had been passionately devoted to music and had attained a considerable proficiency on the violin. In the autumn term of 1841, he made the acquaintance of Mr. William Gaskell, a very talented student at New College, and also a more than tolerable musician. The practice of music was then very much less common at Oxford than it has since become, and there were none of those societies existing which now do so much to promote its study among undergraduates. It was therefore a cause of much gratification to the two young men, and it afterwards became a strong bond of friendship to discover that one was as devoted to the pianoforte as was the other to the violin. Mr. Gaskell, though in easy circumstances, had not a pianoforte in his rooms, and was pleased to use a fine instrument by Delamain that John had had that term received as a birthday present from his guardian. From that time, the two students were thrown much together, and in the autumn term of 1841 and Easter term of 1842, practiced a variety of music in John's rooms, he taking the violin part and Mr. Gaskell that for the pianoforte. It was, I think, in March 1842 that John purchased for his rooms a piece of furniture which was destined afterwards to play no unimportant part in the story I am narrating. This was a very large and low wicker chair of a form then coming into fashion in Oxford, and then, I am told, become a familiar object in most college rooms. It was cushioned with a gaudy pattern of chintz and bought for new of an upholster at the bottom of the High Street. Mr. Gaskell was taken by his uncle to spend Easter in Rome, and obtaining special leave from his college to prolong his travels, did not return to Oxford till 3 weeks of the summer term were past, and May was well advanced. So impatient was he to see his friend that he would not let even the first evening of his return pass without coming round to John's rooms. The two young men sat without lights until the night was late, and Mr. Gaskell had much to narrate of his travels, and spoke specially of the beautiful music which he had heard at Easter in the Roman churches. He had also had lessons on the piano from a celebrated professor of the Italian style, but seemed to have been particularly delighted with the music of the 17th century composers, of whose works he had brought back some specimens set for piano and violin. It was past 11 o'clock when Mr. Gaskell left to return to New College, but the night was unusually warm, with the moon near the full, and John sat for some time in a cushioned window seat before the open sash thinking over what he had heard about the music of Italy. Feeling still disinclined for sleep, he lit a single candle and began to turn over some of the musical works which Mr. Gaskell had left on the table. His attention was especially attracted to an oblong book, bound in soiled vellum, with a coat of arms stamped in gilt upon the side. It was a manuscript copy of some early suites by Graziani for violin and harpsichord, and was apparently written at Naples in the year 1744, many years after the death of that composer. Though the ink was yellow and faded, the transcript had been accurately made and could be read with tolerable comfort by an advanced musician, in spite of the antiquated notation. Perhaps by accident, or perhaps by some mysterious direction which our minds are incapable of appreciating, his eye was arrested by a suite of 4 movements with a basso continuo, or figured bass, for the harpsichord. The other suites in the book were only distinguished by numbers, but this one the composer had dignified with the same name of l'Areopagita. Almost mechanically, John put the book on his music stand, took his violin from its case, and after a moment's tuning, stood up and played the first movement, a lovely coranto. The light of the single candle burned on the table was scarcely sufficient to illuminate the page. The shadows hung in the creases of the leaves, which had grown into those wavy folds sometimes observable in books made of thick paper and remaining long shut, and it was with difficulty that he could read what he was playing. But he felt the strange impulse of the old world music urging him forward, and did not even pause to light the candles which stood ready in their sconces on either side of the desk. The coranto was followed by a sarabanda, and the sarabanda by a galliarda. My brother stood playing, with his face turned to the window, with the room and the large wicker chair of which I have spoken behind him. The Gagliarda began with a bold and lively air, and as he played the opening bars, he heard behind him a creaking of the wicker chair. The sound was a perfectly familiar one, as of some person playing a hand on either arm of the chair, preparatory to lowering himself into it, followed by another, as the same person being leisurely seated. But for the tones of the violin, all was silent, and the creaking of the chair was strangely distinct. The illusion was so complete that my brother stopped playing suddenly and turned round, expecting that some late friend of his had slipped in unawares, being attracted by the sound of the violin, or that Mr. Gaskell himself had returned. With the cessation of the music, an absolute stillness fell upon all. The light of the single candle scarcely reached the darker corners of the room, but fell directly on the wicker chair, and showed it to be perfectly empty. Half amused, half vexed with himself at having without reason interrupted his music, my brother returned to the Gagliarda. But some impulse induced him to light the candles in the sconces, which gave an illumination more adequate to the occasion. The Gagliarda and the last movement, a minuetto, were finished, and John closed the book, intending, as it is now late, to seek his bed. As he shut the pages, a creaking of a wicker chair again attracted his attention, and he heard distinctly sounds such as would be made by a person raising himself from a sitting posture. This time, being less surprised, he could more aptly consider the probable causes of such a circumstance, and easily arrived at the conclusion that there must be in the wicker chair osiers responsive to certain notes of the violin, as panes of glass in church windows are observed to vibrate in sympathy with certain tones of the organ. But while this argument approved itself to his reason, his imagination was but half convinced, and he could not but be impressed with the fact that the second creaking of the chair had been coincident with his shutting the music book, and unconsciously pictured to himself some strange visitor waiting until the termination of the music and then taking his departure. His conjectures did not, however, either rob him of sleep or even disturb it with dreams, and he woke the next morning with a cooler mind and one less inclined to fantastic imagination. If the strange episode of the previous evening had not entirely vanished from his mind, it seemed at least fully accounted for by the acoustic explanation to which I have alluded above. Although he saw Mr. Gaskell in the course of the morning, he did not think it necessary to mention to him so trivial a circumstance, but made with him an appointment to sup together in his own rooms that evening, and to amuse themselves afterwards by essaying some of the Italian music. It was shortly after 9 that night when, supper being finished, Mr. Gaskell seated himself at the piano, and John tuned his violin. The evening was closing in. There had been heavy thunder rain in the afternoon, and the moist air hung now heavy and steaming, while across it there throbbed the distant vibrations of the tenor bell at Christ Church. It was tolling the customary 101 strokes, which are rung every night in term time as a signal for closing the college gates. The two young men enjoyed themselves for some while, playing first a suite by Sesti, and then 2 early sonatas by Bononcini. Both of them were sufficiently expert musicians to make reading at sight a pleasure rather than an effort, and Mr. Gaskell especially was well versed in the theory of music and in the correct rendering of the basso continuo. After the Bononcini, Mr. Gaskell took up the oblong copy of Graziani, and turning over its leaves, proposed that they should play the same suite which John had performed by himself the previous evening. His selection was apparently perfectly fortuitous, as my brother had purposely refrained from directing his attention in any way to that piece of music. They played the Coranto and the Sarabanda, and in the singular fascination of the music, John had entirely forgotten the episode of the previous evening, when, as the bold air of the Gagliarda commenced, he suddenly became aware of the same strange creaking of the wicker chair that he had noticed on the first occasion. The sound was identical, and so exact was its resemblance to that of a person sitting down that he stared at the chair, almost wondering that it still appeared empty. Beyond turning his head sharply for a moment to look round, Mr. Gaskell took no notice of the sound, and my brother, ashamed to betray any foolish interest or excitement, continued the Gagliarda with its repeat. At its conclusion, Mr. Gaskell stopped before proceeding to the minuet, and turning the stool on which he was sitting round towards the room, observed, "How very strange, Johnny." For these young men were on terms of sufficient intimacy to address each other in a familiar style. "How very strange. I thought I heard someone sit down in that chair when we began the Gagliarda. I looked round, quite expecting to see someone had come in. Did you hear nothing?" "It was only the chair creaking," my brother answered, feigning an indifference which he scarcely felt. Certain parts of the wicker work seemed to be in accord with the musical notes and respond to them. Let us continue with the minuetto. Thus they finished the suite, Mr. Gaskell demanding a repetition of the Gagliarda, with the air of which he was very much pleased. As the clocks had already struck 11, they determined not to play more that night, and Mr. Gaskell rose, blew out the sconces, shut the piano, and put the music aside. My brother has often assured me that he was quite prepared for what followed, and had been almost expecting it, for as the books were put away, a creaking of the wicker chair was audible, exactly similar to that which he had heard when he stopped playing on the previous night. There was a moment's silence. The young men looked involuntarily at one another, and then Mr. Gaskell said, "I cannot understand the creaking of that chair. It has never done so before, with all the music we have played. I am perhaps imaginative and excited with the fine airs we have heard tonight, but I have an impression that I cannot dispel that something has been sitting listening to us all this time, and that now when the concert is ended, it has got up and gone." There was a spirit of raillery in his words, but his tone was not so light as it would ordinarily have been, and he was evidently ill at ease. "Let us try the Gagliarda again," said my brother. "It is the vibration of the opening notes which affects the wicker work, and we shall see if the noise is repeated." But Mr. Gaskell excused himself from trying the experiment, and after some desultory conversation, to which it was evident that neither was giving any serious attention, he took his leave and returned to New College. Chapter 2. I shall not weary you, my dear Edward, by recounting similar experiences which occurred on nearly every occasion that the young men met in the evenings for music. The repetition of the phenomena had accustomed them to expect it. Both professed to be quite satisfied that it was to be attributed to acoustical affinities of vibration between the wickerwork and certain of the piano wires, and indeed, this seemed the only explanation possible. But at the same time, the resemblance of the noises to those caused by a person sitting down in or rising from a chair was so marked that even their frequent recurrence never failed to make a strange impression on them. They felt a reluctance to mention the matter to their friends, partly from a fear of being themselves laughed at, and partly despair from ridicule, a circumstance to which each perhaps, in spite of himself, attached some degree of importance. Experience soon convinced them that the first noise of one sitting down never occurred unless the Gagliarda of the Areopagita was played, and that this noise being once heard, the second only followed it when they ceased playing for the evening. They met every night, sitting later with the lengthening summer evenings, and every night, as by some tacit understanding, played the Areopagita suite before parting. At the opening bars of the Gagliarda, the creaking of the chair occurred spontaneously with the utmost regularity. They seldom spoke, even to one another, of the subject, but one night, when John was putting away his violin after a long evening's music without having played the Areopagita, Mr. Gaskell, who had risen from the pianoforte, sat down again, as by a sudden impulse, and said, "Johnny, do not put away your violin yet. It is near 12 o'clock, and I shall get shut out, but I cannot stop tonight without playing the Gagliarda. Suppose that all of our theories of vibration and affinity are wrong. Suppose that there really comes here, night by night, some strange visitant to hear us, some poor creature whose heart is bound up in that tune. Would it not be unkind to send him away without the hearing of that piece which he seems most to relish? Let us not be ill-mannered, but humor his whim. Let us play the Gagliarda." They played it with more vigor and precision than usual, and the now customary sound of one taking his seat at once ensued. It was that night that my brother, looking steadfastly at the chair, saw, or thought he saw, there some slight obscuration, some penumbra, mist, or subtle vapor, which, as he gazed, seemed to struggle to take human form. He ceased playing for a moment and rubbed his eyes, but as he did so, all dimness vanished, and he saw the chair perfectly empty. The pianist stopped also at the cessation of the violin and asked what ailed him. "It is only that my eyes were dim," he answered. "We have had enough for tonight," said Mr. Gaskell. "Let us stop. I shall be locked out." He shut the piano, and as he did so, the clock in New College Tower struck 12. He left the room running, but was late enough at his college door to be reported, admonished with a fine against such late hours, and confined for a week to college, for being out after midnight was considered, at the time at least, a somewhat serious offense. Thus for some days, the musical practice was compulsorily intermitted, but resumed on the first evening after Mr. Gaskell's term of confinement was expired. After they had performed several suites of Graziani, and finished, as usual, with the Areopagita, Mr. Gaskell sat for a time silent at the instrument, as though thinking with himself, and then said, "I cannot say how deeply this old-fashioned music affects me. Some would try to persuade us that these suites, of which the airs bear the names of different dances, were always written rather as a musical essay, and for purposes of performance, than for persons to dance to, as their names would more naturally imply. But I think these critics are wrong, at least in some instances. It is to me impossible to believe that such a melody, for instance, as the Giga of Corelli, which we have played, was not written for actual purposes of dancing. One can almost hear the beat of feet upon the floor, and I imagine that in the time of Corelli, the practice of dancing, while not a whit inferior in grace, had more of the trepidistic or beating character than is now esteemed consistent with a correct ballroom performance. The Gagliarda, too, which we play now so constantly, possesses a singular power of assisting the imagination to picture or reproduce such scenes as those which it no doubt formerly enlivened. I know not why, but it is constantly identified in my mind with some revel which I have perhaps seen in a picture, where several couples are dancing a licentious measure in a long room lit by a number of silver sconces of the debased model common at the end of the 17th century. It is probably a reminiscence of my late excursion that gives to these dancers in my fancy the olive skin, dark hair, and bright eyes of the Italian type, and they wear dresses of exceedingly rich fabric and elaborate design. Imagination is whimsical enough to paint for me the character of the room itself, as having an arcade of arches running down one side alone, of the fantastic and paganized Gothic of the Renaissance. At the end is a gallery or balcony for the musicians, which on its coved front has a florid coat of arms of foreign heraldry. The shield bears, on a field, or a cherub's head, blowing on 3 lilies, a blazon I have no doubt seen somewhere in my travels, though I cannot recollect where. This scene, I say, is so nearly connected in my brain with the Gagliarda that scarcely are its first notes sounded ere it presents itself to my eyes with a vividness which increases every day. The couples advance, set, and recede, using free and licentious gestures which my imagination should be ashamed to recall. Among so many foreigners, fancy pictures, I know not, in least why, the presence of a young man of an English type of face, whose features, however, always elude my mind's attempt to fix them. I think that the opening subject of this Gagliarda is a superior composition to the rest of it, for it is only during the first 16 bars that the vision of bygone revelry presents itself to me. With the last note of the 16th bar, a veil is drawn suddenly across the scene, and with a sense almost of some catastrophe, it vanishes. This I attribute to the fact that the second subject must be inferior in conception to the first, and by some sense of incongruity destroys the fabric which the fascination of the preceding one built up. My brother, though he had listened with interest to what Mr. Gaskell had said, did not reply, and the subject was allowed to drop. Chapter 3. It was in the same summer of 1842, and near the middle of June, that my brother John wrote inviting me to come to Oxford at the commemoration festivities. I had been spending some weeks with Mrs. Temple, a distant cousin of ours, at their house of Royston in Derbyshire, and John was desirous that Mrs. Temple should come up to Oxford and chaperone her daughter Constance and myself at the balls and various other entertainments which take place at the close of the summer term. Owing to Royston being some 200 miles from Worth Maltravers, our families had hitherto seen little of one another. But during my present visit, I learned to love Mrs. Temple, a lady of singular sweetness of disposition, and had contracted a devoted attachment to her daughter, Constance. Constance Temple was then 18 years of age, and to great beauty united such mental graces and excellent traits of character as must ever appear to reasoning persons more enduringly valuable than even the highest personal attractions. She was well-read and witty, and had even been trained in those principles of true religion which she afterwards followed with devoted consistency in the self-sacrifice and resigned piety of her too short life. In person, I may remind you, my dear Edward, since death removed her, you were of years to appreciate either her appearance or her qualities. She was tall, with a somewhat long and oval face, with brown hair and eyes. Mrs. Temple readily accepted Sir John Maltravers' invitation. She had never seen Oxford herself, and was pleased to afford us the pleasure of so delightful an excursion. John had secured convenient rooms for us above the shop of a well-known print seller in High Street, and we arrived in Oxford on Friday evening, June 18th, 1842. I shall not dilate to you on the various commemoration festivities, which have probably altered little since those days, and with which you are familiar. Suffice it to say that my brother had secured us admission to every entertainment, and enjoyed our visit as only youth with his keen sensibilities and uncloyed pleasures can. I could not help observing that John was very much struck by the attractions of Miss Constance Temple, and that she, for her part, while exhibiting no unbecoming forwardness, certainly betrayed no aversion to him. I was greatly pleased both with my own powers of observation, which enabled me to discover so important a fact, and also with the circumstance itself. To a romantic girl of 19, it appeared high time that a brother of 22 should be at least preparing for some matrimonial project, and my friend was so good and beautiful that it seemed impossible that I should ever obtain a more lovable sister, or my brother a better wife. Mrs. Temple could not refuse her sanction to such a scheme, for while their mental qualities seemed eminently compatible, John was in his own right master of Worth Maltravers, and her daughter sole heiress to the Royston estates. The commemoration festivities terminated on Wednesday night with a grand ball at the music room in Holywell Street. This was given by a lodge of university Freemasons, and John was there with Mrs. Gaskell, whose acquaintance we had made with much gratification, both wearing blue silk scarves and small white aprons. They introduced us to many other of their friends similarly adorned, and these important and mysterious insignia sat not amiss with their youthful figures and boyish faces. After a long and pleasurable program, it was decided that we should prolong our visit till the next evening, leaving Oxford at 10:30 at night and driving to Didcot, there to join the mail for the West. We rose late the next morning and spent the day rambling among the old colleges and gardens of the most beautiful of English cities. At 7 o'clock, we dined together for the last time at our lodgings in High Street, and my brother proposed that before parting, we should enjoy the fine evening in the gardens of St. John's College. This was at once agreed to, and we proceeded thither, John walking in front with Constance and Mrs. Temple, and I following with Mrs. Gaskell. My companion explained that these gardens were esteemed the most beautiful in the university, but that under ordinary circumstances, it was not permitted to strangers to walk there of an evening. Here he quoted with some Latin about aurum per medios, your satellites, which I smilingly made as if I understood, and did indeed gather from it that John had bribed the porter to admit us. It was a warm and very still night, without a moon, but with enough fading light to show the outlines of the garden front. This long, low line of buildings built in Charles I's reign looked so exquisitely beautiful that I shall never forget it, though I have not since seen its oriel windows and creeper-covered walls. There was a very heavy dew on the broad lawn, and we walked at first only in paths. No one spoke, for we were oppressed by the very beauty of the scene, and by the sadness which an imminent parting from friends and from so sweet a place combined to cause. John had been silent and depressed the whole day, nor did Mr. Gaskell himself seem inclined to conversation. Constance and my brother fell a little way behind, and Mr. Gaskell asked me to cross the lawn if I was not afraid of the dew, that I might see the garden front to better advantage from the corner. Mrs. Temple waited for us on the path, not wishing to wet her feet. Mr. Gaskell pointed out the beauties of the perspective as seen from his vantage point, and we were fortunate in hearing the sweet descant of nightingales for which this garden has ever been famous. As we stood silent and listening, a candle was lit in a small oriel at the end, and the light showing the tracery of the window added to the picturesqueness of the scene. Within an hour, we were in Landau, driving from the still warm lanes of Didcot. I had seen that Constance's parting with my brother had been tender, and I am not sure that she was in tears during some part, at least, of our drive. But I did not observe her closely, having my thoughts elsewhere. Though we were thus being carried every moment further from the sleeping city, where I believe that both our hearts were busy, I feel as if I had been a personal witness of the incidents I am about to narrate. So often have I heard them from my brother's lips. The two young men, after parting with us in the High Street, returned to their respective colleges. John reached his room shortly before 11 o'clock. He was at once sad and happy, sad at our departure, but happy in a newfound world of delight which his admiration for Constance Temple opened to him. He was, in fact, deeply in love with her, and with the full blood of a hitherto unknown passion filled him with an emotion so overwhelming that his ordinary life seemed transfigured. He moved, as it were, in an ether superior to our mortal atmosphere, and a new region of high resolves and noble possibilities spread itself before his eyes. He slammed his heavy outside door, called an oak, to prevent anyone entering, and flung himself into the window seat. Here he sat for a long time, the sash thrown up and his head outside, for he was excited and feverish. His mental exaltation was so great, and his thoughts of so absorbing an interest, that he took no notice of time, and only remembered afterwards that the scent of a syringa bush had borne up to him from a little garden patch opposite, and that a bat had circled slowly up and down the lane until he heard the clock striking 3. At the same time, the faint light of dawn made itself felt almost imperceptibly. The classic statues on the roof of the schools began to stand out against the white sky, and a faint glimmer to penetrate the darkened room. It glistened on the varnished top of his violin case lying on the table, and on a jug of toast and water, placed here by his college servant or scout every night before he left. He drank a glass of this mixture and was moving towards his bedroom door when a sudden thought struck him. He turned back, took the violin from its case, tuned it, and began to play the Areopagita suite. He was conscious of that mental clearness and vigor which not infrequently comes with the dawn to those who have sat watching or reading through the night, and his thoughts were exalted by the effect which the first consciousness of a deep passion causes in imaginative minds. He had never played the suite with more power, and the airs, even without the piano part, seemed fraught with a meaning hitherto unrealized. As he began the Galliarda, he heard the wicker chair creak, but he had his back towards it, and the sound was now too familiar to him to cause him even to look around. It was not till he was playing the repeat that he became aware of a new and overpowering sensation. At first, it was a vague feeling, so often experienced by us all, of not being alone. He did not stop playing, and in a few seconds the impression of a presence in the room other than his own became so strong that he was actually afraid to look around. But in another moment, he felt that at all hazards he must see what or who this presence was. Without stopping, he partly turned and partly looked over his shoulder. The silver light of early morning was filling the room, making the various objects appear of less bright color than usual, and giving to everything a pearl gray, neutral tint. In this cold but clear light, he saw seated in the wicker chair the figure of a man. In the first violent shock of so terrifying a discovery, he could not appreciate such details as those features, dress, or appearance. He was merely conscious that with him, in a locked room, of which he knew himself to be the only human inmate, there sat something which bore a human form. He looked at it for a moment with a hope, which he felt to be vain, that it might vanish and prove a phantom of his excited imagination, but still it sat there. Then my brother put down his violin, and he used to assure me that a horror overwhelmed him of an intensity which he had previously believed impossible. Whether the image which he saw was subjective or objective, I cannot pretend to say. You will be in a position to judge for yourself when you have finished this narrative. Our limited experience would lead us to believe that it was a phantom conjured up by some unusual condition of his own brain. But we are fain to confess that there certainly do exist in nature phenomena such as baffle human reason, and it is possible that for some hidden purposes of providence, permission may occasionally be granted to those who have passed from this life to assume again for a time the form of their earthly tabernacle. We must, I say, be content to suspend our judgment on such matters. But in this instance, the subsequent course of events is very difficult to explain, except on the supposition that there was then presented to my brother's view the actual bodily form of one long deceased. The dread which took possession of him was due. He has more than once told me, when analyzing his feelings long afterwards, to two predominant causes. Firstly, he felt that mental dislocation which accompanies the sudden subversion of preconceived theories, the sudden alteration of long habit, or even the occurrence of any circumstance beyond the walk of our daily experience. This I have observed myself in the perturbing effect which a sudden death, a grievous accident, or in recent years, the declaration of war has exercised upon all except the most lethargic or the most determined minds. Secondly, he experienced the profound self-abasement or mental annihilation caused by the near conception of a being of a superior order. In the presence of an existence wearing, indeed, the human form, but of attributes widely different from and superior to his own, he felt the combined reverence and revulsion which even the noblest wild animals exhibit when brought for the first time face to face with man. The shock was so great that I feel persuaded it exerted an effect on him from which he never wholly recovered. After an interval which seemed to him interminable, though it was only of a second's duration, he turned his eyes again to the occupant of the wicker chair. His faculties had so far recovered from the first shock as to enable him to see that the figure was that of a man perhaps 35 years of age and still youthful in appearance. The face was long and oval, the hair brown, and brushed straight off with an exceptionally high forehead. His complexion was very pale or bloodless. He was clean-shaven, and his finely cut mouth, with compressed lips, wore something of a sneering smile. His general expression was unpleasing, and from the first my brother felt, as by intuition, that there was present some malign and wicked influence. His eyes were not visible, as he kept them cast down, resting his head on his hand in an attitude of one listening. His face and even his dress were impressed so vividly upon John's mind that he never had any difficulty in recalling them to his imagination, and he and I afterwards an opportunity of verifying them in a remarkable manner. He wore a long, cutaway coat of green cloth with an edge of gold embroidery and a white satin waistcoat, figured with rose sprigs, a full cravat of rich lace, knee breeches of buff silk, and stockings of the same. His shoes were of polished black leather with heavy silver buckles, and his costume in general recalled that worn a century ago. As my brother gazed at him, he got up, putting his hands on the arms of the chair to raise himself, and causing the creaking so often heard before. The hands forced themselves on my brother's notice. They were very white, with the long, delicate fingers of a musician. He showed a considerable height, and still keeping his eyes on the floor, walked with an ordinary gait towards the end of the bookcase at the side of the room farthest from the window. He reached the bookcase, and then John suddenly lost sight of him. The figure did not fade gradually, but went out, as it were, like the flame of a suddenly extinguished candle. The room was now filled with the clear light of the summer morning. The whole vision had lasted but a few seconds, but my brother knew that there was no possibility of his having been mistaken, that the mystery of the creaking chair was solved, that he had seen the man who had come evening by evening for a month past to listen to the rhythm of the Galliarda. Terribly disturbed, he sat for some time, half dreading and half expecting a return of the figure, but all remained unchanged. He saw nothing, nor did he dare to challenge its reappearance by playing again the Galliarda, which seemed to have so strange an attraction for it. At last, in the full sunlight of a late June morning at Oxford, he heard the steps of early pedestrians on the pavement below his windows, the cry of a milkman the other sounds, which showed the world was awake. It was after 6 o'clock, and going to his bedroom, he flung himself on the outside of the bed for an hour's troubled slumber. Thank you for listening to Sleepy. Good night.